This is a production of Cornell University.
Thanks so much, Steve. And thanks so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be out here. So as Steve said, my background is in geography. So I tend to be interested in something like this that you see in the background slide here. This is an invasion of Sahara mustard in the Mojave Desert out in the western US. But I rarely get the chance to actually see any of these things in the field because for the most part, what I do is use data that other people have collected from the field to try to understand stuff about the spatial distributions of either distributions or abundance of species. So what biogeography is, and that was kind of an introduction to it, but biogeography is basically trying to use the distributions of species to learn something more about the biology of those species, about the ecology, how those species interact with native communities, if we're talking about an invasive species like oriental bittersweet, the evolution of those species, how those species have interacted over larger time or adaptations to global change. So we're really saying, all right, people have gone out and collected all of these locations where we know this species exists, and what can that information tell us about, in this case, invasion risk of a species. And there is an assumption in biogeography, and particularly when we're talking about regional scale, but this affects landscape scale models as well, that basically the distribution of this species, whatever this species is that you're seeing over here, is a reasonable approximation of where that species could be. So basically, where the suitable climate is for that species is described pretty well by where that species is right now. And that assumption that the distribution of a species is a good approximation of where that species could be, of suitable climate for that species, has been used for a number of different papers. These ones are, now probably classic papers when you're talking about global change and species movement and species distributions, to predict things like what species are likely to go extinct associated with climate change, right? They're here now, but under warming temperatures and altered precipitation, the richness or diversity of species at any one of these red spots could decrease because we know what their ranges are now, and we know, or we're predicting what their ranges might be in the future. That's been done in Europe and Mexico, globally. This assumption of that distributions of species are a good approximation for suitable climate has also been done for activities like predicting or assigning conservation priorities. So, where are the species now, and what does that tell us about where they could be, where lots of them are likely to overlap in these kind of red and yellow areas. It's also been done, so this is an example that I've done on modeling potential for invasion with climate change. So in this case, you've got kudzu, which is really badass down in the southeast US, right? You can see the end of that car. This is actually a house under here, right? So not a place that you want to live if you've got kudzu in your backyard. And this is just an example showing expansion of kudzu up into the northeast, into New York and in Massachusetts, where I'm from, by the end of this century with climate change. But again, all of these are based on this assumption that distribution is a good approximation of suitable climate. And so what I want to do, and I'm going to get a little wonky here, I think, into the biogeography side of things, but holding to that application of really what all of this is trying to get at is how much are we going to trust, and in what cases should we be trusting spatial models to really inform what we're doing on the ground, our monitoring, our management, everything else. So I'm going to look at two different questions today. The first one is a question of comparative equilibrium. So how much are those species distributions approximating climate for native versus non-native plants? And then we're going to explore the native plants a little bit further in the second half and ask whether native plant ranges are really describing their climatic tolerance. And so to start on that first one, the equilibrium assumption, and this is really fundamental to a lot of biogeography. Equilibrium assumption says, going back to Hutchinson's paper of 1957, species is at equilibrium with its environment when it's present basically everywhere that it could be, all of the suitable areas, but not present or absent, and all of the areas that are unsuitable for that species, right? And so if we're doing any kind of model based on whether it's climatic suitability or other, the suitability of the soils or other features of a landscape for a species, we're assuming that this is true for that species, that it is present where it could be present and absent where it cannot be present. But the problem with any kind of distribution model is that we could always be missing something, right? So if our model is based on all of these gray points in here, and we're missing these, green points out over here, then the model that we're going to create is not going to be an accurate representation of the temperature and precipitation conditions that this species could exist in, right? So why might we be missing the species out here? Well, it could be because we just didn't survey that area. We're missing a couple of points that the species actually exists in. It could be that it's some sort of, an invasive species that started out over here and just hasn't expanded to those areas yet. It could be that these temperature and precipitation conditions don't currently exist on our landscape, but they might under future climate conditions. And so how do we deal with those kind of challenges in the modeling framework? So for invasive species in particular, this assumption of equilibrium, the assumption that a species is describing its full niche, its full area that it could particularly persist in, is fundamentally flawed for an invasive species, right? Because we know that invasive species are spreading across landscapes, they're spreading across regions. This is an example of the kudzu beetle, this guy over here, which does in fact eat kudzu, I'm told, but it also eats soybeans. So that's the drawback of why we're concerned about this particular pest. And this is just the spread between 2009 and 2012, right? So really broad scale spread of that particular pest. If you only considered the distribution of where it was in that early stage of infestation, then you'd probably be missing a large scale. And in fact, even out to 2012 is probably missing to a large degree where that species could specifically exist. So what we're going to do is try to tackle this question for invasive plants specifically. So we're asking, how bad is this equilibrium assumption? How far off are we in general when we're talking about invasive plants from equilibrium with the environment? And this is from a paper published almost 2 years ago in Global Ecology and Biogeography, if you're interested in the more details. But the way we wanted to go about this is we know that there's never any species that's going to be in perfect equilibrium, right? There's always going to be some place that species either wasn't able to get to or that space climatically doesn't exist yet or something like that. So there's no way that we can define this perfect equilibrium. But what we can do is we can compare native and invasive species and say, relative to each other, how far off are invasive species, right? How much should we be worried about missing something in terms of our modeling of invasive plants? And so here's our hypothesis. Our hypothesis is that for a native plant, they have had lots and lots of time, so if we, even just going back to the last glacial maximum, we say 20,000 plus years for these species to move around. In other places that were less affected by glaciation, you've got way more time for them to move around. And so for a given number of occurrences, we would expect that those species of native species would be more widely distributed and that they would also have a larger modeled potential range based on that broad distribution. In contrast, we might hypothesize that non-native plants, including invasive plants, would have a much smaller distribution relative with the same number of occurrences and a smaller modeled potential range. And that those two things, we could sort of say, all right, that also affects the longitudinal and latitudinal extent of those species, that your native species you would expect to be more widespread than your non-native species. So this is just a way of presenting that previous graph in terms of some line graphs. And of course, as you increase the number of occurrences, you would expect both of these things to go up in terms of your overall potential range, but we would expect that the native species would be higher overall than the non-natives. So how did we test this? We went about testing this using all of the plants that we could find within the continental US. So we downloaded the whole list of plants from the USDA plants database. That's actually closer to about 20,000 species that you find within the continental US. The USDA breaks those into native species, endemic species, alien, so these are non-native species. And then from the alien ones, we also separated out the invasive species based on ones that are either noxious weeds or identified as invasive plants on the invasive plant atlas of the US. And endemics, USDA doesn't actually break that down, so endemics we got from another database and separated those out into as well in case something interesting was happening. And then we looked at, so we cross-referenced that database against all of the herbarium records that are available in this global biodiversity information facility repository for global herbarium records. So lots of states, regions are putting their data into that repository. These are where the plants have actually been found and someone has a geographical latitude, longitude record of where those species came from. And that ended up with our 13,585 total species that actually had enough records in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility database that we could create a reasonable model based on them. And so the analysis of this was that we took a particular species, so all these dot circles are the location of that particular species. We used a pretty simple PCA-based model to look at potential range of those species, which is showing up in here in this kind of light yellow color. And we said potential range is just a count of all of these pixels, these yellow areas of where that species could potentially be located. And then we looked at one other thing. We looked at range infilling, which is basically the ratio of where all of these species are present to all of these areas where it could be present, because we thought, well, if we're thinking about invasive species in particular, can we say something about more invasion likely on the horizon associated with where it is relative to where it could be? So just to go back to that hypothesis again, so look first at latitudinal and longitudinal ranges. So our prediction again is that our native species, both native and endemic species together, should be more widespread. They've had way more time to spread across landscapes and regions in which they could have climatic suitability than our relatively recently introduced invasive and alien species. So there's our prediction, and here's our result. Exactly the opposite of what we predicted. So whereas we thought our natives and endemics, or I guess I should say that anytime you read biogeography literature related to invasive species, you always have this kind of clause at the beginning that says, oh, we know that invasive species are not at equilibrium, so this is probably an under-prediction. So what we're seeing is actually the exact opposite, that it's our natives and endemic species that are much more narrowly distributed, both longitudinally and latitudinally. Not a significant difference between our invasives and our aliens, or between our natives and endemics, but between the two groups, a very strong and significant difference. That second hypothesis, you guys can probably figure out where we're going on this one, that the potential range then of native species would be greater on average than non-native species. Nope, we find exactly the opposite, that as you have increasing occurrences of either non-native or native species, you're seeing this increase in potential range that you might expect, but consistently it's the non-native species, the non-natives and the invasives, that are higher up in terms of the modeled potential range than our native plants are. And so we're fundamentally rejecting this hypothesis, or this sort of framing that it's actually that non-native plants are really not at equilibrium with climate. In fact, what we're seeing is, compared to native plants, arguably it's the non-native plants that are closer to climatic equilibrium. The non-native plants that are probably creating better models of distribution of risk of range shifts associated with climate change. And so why is that? Okay, so probably the reason is because we are really good at introducing invasive plants, right? We know that most of the population of invasive plants in the US, at least 60%, probably more than that, are introduced as ornamental plants. certainly a much higher proportion of that for our non-native, non-invasive plants are introduced as ornamentals. And so here's an example of, this is a Centaurea species, so bachelor's button. This is declared as a noxious weed in the southeast part of the US, I think in Tennessee, but is obviously really widespread, introduced and planted in our gardens across the US. And its potential range, as you can see from that light yellow, really, really broad because it's inhabiting all of these different climate conditions across the US. You can compare that, so here's your bachelor button with 458 occurrences. This species is getting pretty much the entire US. It takes almost double that number of occurrences for the average native species to get even close to that, and it's not even fully getting there in terms of the full range. So even our most common native species are still showing much more of this clumping, bunching than our kind of average non-native or invasive species. Oops. So range filling was that other question. Okay, and you guys can probably guess based on the way these graphs look. Range infilling is that question of how much more space is there to go? How much more can the species extend? So here's our native species. You can see that there is still a fair bit of this light yellow space within its potential range, but for the invasive species, there's tons of that light yellow potential range. So if we look at range infilling, we're seeing that, that the native species are much more kind of clumped together and have infilled within their ranges, whereas the invasive species not at all. And so for the average invasive plant is filling in only half as much of its potential range relative to the average native species, right? So if we think that your average invasive plant is going to behave like your average native plant, then that means that we are currently only about halfway there in terms of the amount of spread within landscapes or within those regions that these plants could potentially do. So here's an example. This is a bamboo species where, here are all of the locations where this bamboo has been introduced. And we know, and in fact, this is up into New Jersey as well, and there are a bunch of pictures of people already getting angry at their neighbors for planting bamboo that's coming into their yards. So we know that these species are likely to. This guy up here in New Jersey was pretty angry about his neighbor's bamboo coming into his yard. And here we've got some of natural spaces and open spaces that are already being taken over by that species, which is an ornamental plant that's widely planted across the southeast. So that tells us, which is really, from a biogeography perspective, this is really interesting because it tells us kind of two things. One, it tells us that actually a lot of our risk assessments for invasive plants relative to climate and relative to climate change are probably pretty good, or at least pretty good relative to natives. But it also tells us that the natives, our projections relative to climate change might be a little bit sketchy, right? Because the natives are not apparently distributed and facilitated by us in terms of being introduced in all of these places. So for invasive plants, unlike what we had expected, the invasive plants are actually very widespread, could be considered much closer to this climatic equilibrium than the native plants are. But we also see that there's really low range filling associated with invasive plants. And so there's probably a lot more of these landscape scale invasions that we should expect on the horizon, as if we don't have enough to deal with. Great, so that was the first question. So I kind of alluded to the second question when I said that the equilibrium analysis that we did left this kind of question about what's going on with native species, right? If we start out with this framing that says invasive species are the ones that are not at equilibrium, and now we're saying, well, actually, it looks like it's native species that are less like equilibrium, that raises the question of, well, how well are native species doing? How well are plants' ranges within their native ranges describing, so sort of going after that same question, but their climatic tolerance or their equilibrium in that case with climate. And there is ongoing kind of large-scale discussion of this question both within, well, particularly within the invasive plant literature. This was a paper from, I think, 2011, where what they were looking at was basically you have a bunch of species that come from Europe and they're moving to North America. North America to Europe is in this one, and Europe to North America is in this one. And basically the blue on here are areas that are where that species is inhabiting the same climate space, both in Europe and in North America. So these guys are mostly blue on both of these, like a little bit of area where the species is expanding its climatic niche, basically, as it moves from one continent to another. But their underlying statement here was that it's pretty rare for a species to change its climate space. Basically, you know, if you've got a species in Europe and it's within this particular temperature and precipitation regime, you move it to North America, for the most part, it's going to be within the same temperature and precipitation regime. And that would suggest, if that's the case for invasive species, that suggests that for most species, you know, like if you've got a given temperature and climatic regime, then that's probably what that species can persist under, right? So this is arguing for equilibrium or close to equilibrium for these range-shifting plants. There was another study that was published only a couple years after that that came to basically the exact opposite conclusion, that also looked for species that were native to Europe and shifting into North America. And basically, in this case, all of the orange areas are ones where there was this climatic niche expansion. And that's most of North America had this niche expansion. So these two papers are basically arguing the exact opposite conclusions with this, you know, what seemingly similar set of species that are moving from Europe to North America and vice versa. So, so that is sort of fundamental to this question as well of, well, how much are native species generally in equilibrium with climate conditions? And this is a paper that was published about a year ago. If you guys want more of the details, was actually our first author on this was a UMass undergraduate student who compiled all of the data for this paper. So here's our hypothesis. Our hypothesis is we're just going to look at species that are native to the US. And this species, for example, of Texas sedge, we're going to assume that that has a particular climatic tolerance associated that can be described based on its native range. And that if that species of Texas sedge were moved over to Nevada or California, that it would be within the same climatic conditions as are found in its native range. So here we are looking specifically at species that are native to the US, so described by this Biota of North America program, but also have adventive range, so basically a non-native range within the US as well. These are almost all exclusively species that are within the ornamental plant industry, so they are cultivated species that have been taken from parts of the US and planted elsewhere in the US. And so what we did was we looked for all of the occurrence data that we could find within both that Global Biodiversity Information Facility as one source. We also, because not all herbaria are up to date in terms of reporting there, looked at a whole bunch of different regional herbaria for any occurrence data that we could find in both the native range as well as this adventive introduced range. And we know the adventive range because the Biota of North America program tells us where its native range is. And then we compare the climate conditions between those two locations. So are the areas where it's been introduced outside of its native range under similar climate conditions to the ones where it's native? So here's an example of a species. This is Chionanthus virginicus. It's a white fringe tree or something like that. So what you see on this map are the light blue areas are all of the counties that this tree is native to all across the Southeast. And then we have all of the occurrence locations that we have in the dark blue dots as well as the red dots. The dark blue dots are the ones where the occurrence of that species is within its native range, and the red dots are the ones where the occurrence is outside of its native range, including up in New York and Massachusetts and Connecticut and stuff like that, and also including up here in the Pacific Northwest, where that species has been introduced. And so here's what we find with that particular species, which probably doesn't surprise you too much looking at this map. We know that the conditions in New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts are pretty different from, the climate conditions down here. That generally, what we see for this particular species is that it is persisting in these areas where it's been introduced, in areas that are cooler than its native range, and also slightly drier. So, a couple of points in areas that are slightly drier than its native range. So the reds on here are all of those adventive, the introduced points, and the blue on here are all of the native points. And you can see that there's also plenty of overlap. So there are lots of climate conditions in the adventive range that are well represented within the native range. But definitely a little bit cooler, a little bit drier on here. So how does that compare to the overall number of species? So remember, we had 144 species that we were working with. 90 of those showed lower precipitation in the areas where they were introduced relative to their native range. And the median decrease, I don't know what the right word is, the median amount of precipitation lower than its native range was 23 centimeters, which is pretty substantive. I've done a lot of work in the Western US, and there are a lot of places that barely get 23 centimeters of rain, so that's pretty substantive. And 90 out of the 144 species are showing that expansion of drought tolerance. We're also seeing 56 of the species, 56 of our 144 showed an expansion of heat tolerance, with the median amount being 1.2 degrees C warmer. Part of the reason for that there aren't super number of species that are going in this direction may just be the geography of the US, that there's a lot more space as you go further north than going south. If you look at cold tolerance, so we had 80 out of 144 species showed an expansion of cold tolerance and a median of 2.9 degrees C, different in terms of that climatic range that could be described. And then that last piece was that we also modeled the potential range of all of these species, right? So here's for that one particular species, so Chionanthus virginicus, the blue is its potential range based on just its native range. And the red is its potential range based on the native plus the adventive range, right? So you see, in that case, we're getting quite a bit up into New England and further north from that native southeast range. So that's one species. On average, 128 of our 144 species showed an expansion of their potential range when you considered both the native and the adventive points. The median amount of expansion was 35%, or 700,000 square kilometers, which I learned last night is about 5 times the size of the state of New York. So that's a pretty big area. If you're thinking about, okay, we want to understand how species are likely to move with climate change and what their current range is, and we're missing 5 New York states, then that's a pretty big area that we're underestimating currently. So this hypothesis that we started out with, that adventive locations of that species are going to be really similar to the climate space where they started out, is not supported. That in fact we're seeing the opposite, right? So we're trying to dig a little bit into this. Well, what sort of species are actually expanding the most in terms of their climate space? So we said, well, maybe if they have more points in the adventive range, those are the species, if they've got wider introductions, maybe they'll have this larger range size expansion. And we don't see that at all. There's just kind of a big clump there. So it doesn't matter how many times you've been introduced. But what does seem to matter is the size of your native range. So for species that had relatively small areas to begin with, as you start introducing points outside of there, we very rapidly get a big shift in climate space and a much larger predicted range size as you start adding more adventive locations. So these species with small native ranges appear to be less limited by climate. That is, climate, we could make a really nice model of climate describing their range, but it's not actually climate that's limiting the ranges of those narrow range species. And just to go back to this comparison early on, that initial framing, right, where Early and Sachs say huge amount of niche expansion when you move from North America to the US, and Petit-Pierre say no niche expansion when you move from Europe to the US. When you actually plot those species together relative to what their native range size is, you see a very similar pattern. If you, like the Petit-Pierre study, had a really large, like you were really widespread weedy species all across Europe to begin with, you get introduced to North America, you're not expanding much because you're all over the place to begin with in Europe. But in the early and Sachs paper, they were looking at a lot of species that were had much narrower ranges in Europe, and so they had a lot more space to expand and climate space that they were expanding into when they got to the US. So what that tells us basically is when we go back to these fundamental concerns, and certainly this is a fundamental concern when we're talking about climate change, of what's going to happen to rare species, what's happening to these really narrow range species. This analysis and my current thinking on this is that, well, we've done a lot of climate modeling and constructed all of these things for these really small range species, but it may actually be that climate is not what's important for the ranges of those species. So that doesn't mean that they're not still threatened by climate change. If you're narrow range to begin with, you've got a lot of other problems going on too, and the climate change may very well affect those species in place to a large degree. But what it doesn't necessarily mean, and what these guys had said previously, doesn't necessarily mean that those species cannot move into a new climate conditions or expand into other parts. So our conclusions from this are that the native ranges basically, especially small range native species, are not doing a good job of describing climate tolerance for the native plant pool, at least. And this may be a little bit of a silver lining in terms of projections of risk for climate change, that many of these small range species, if we were to start considering tools like assisted migration or moving some of these species in advance of climate change, that those may well be effective mechanisms currently, even if a distribution model or the geography of its current location would not suggest that it can establish and persist beyond where it currently does. So these are just to go back to the conclusions of these two studies. That spatial modeling, anytime you guys look at a biogeographic model, anytime you look at a landscape ecology model that's based on the distribution of species, those are assuming that the distribution of that species is reflecting the habitat of that species. And so I hope that I've told, I hope that I haven't convinced you that distribution modeling is crap, because there are definitely some good examples to use it for. But what I want to convince you of today is just that there's more nuance to understanding when we should really believe the models, and when we should kind of raise an eyebrow and say, well, are you sure that that model is representative of the species that I only know in 10 or 20 or something like that locations. So thanks so much for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So thanks for the presentation. I was glad with this last one. When I was looking at the earlier models that you were showing, what struck me was they were habitat planned, and really no discussion of like herbivores or any suite of other things, right? Like with the simple expansion system. I mean, I would expect the plants to expand and contract, right? That's herbivores come in. Quite often we see that in spatial dynamic context, expansion, contraction, interaction with pressures and things like that. So none of these models take those kinds of things into consideration.
Yeah, so this is a real challenge in terms of just the data that exists out there, right? So anytime that you're dealing with a spatial model, for the most part, the underlying data are just points in space. And those points could be occurrences, they could be absences, they could have some abundance information in them, but that's fairly rare. There are a lot of folks who are really trying to get after building more spatial demographic models, understanding interactions between predator-prey or insect-plant. And the challenge of that is just like, how do you get both spatial and demographic data of multiple species together? And I think it's coming. It's just that we need to really focus our data compilation and collection in the direction that you would need to support that kind of model. Yeah, and I mean the other challenge is that you end up doing it for a couple of specific species. Some of the great things about just spatial modeling generally is that you can do it for lots of different species and try to see if consistent trends emerge, such that you can say something, something relevant.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just have a question about your native versus adventive distinction. So climate's changing. Did you look at all at whether the adventive data are newer with a modified climate compared to the native data, which may tend to be many decades older?
No, that's a really good point. The other question with that paper also is we don't necessarily know that those species are established. Right. We assume that they are because they're in herbarium records, and herbarium records generally go for areas that are relatively natural and not like in the watered, fields or something like that. I don't know that we look specifically for dates on a lot of those records. A lot of the herbarium records that we have are relatively new. So there are definitely some that go back to the 60s, 70s or earlier, but the big chunk when you actually look at them are like from the 90s and later on. So I think relative to current climate change, that's probably a time period when we can say it's been relatively similar for the last 20 or 30 years, when most of those points are coming from. But that's a really good question.
Yeah, in comparing the native species with introduced, it occurred to me that the introduced species tend to be introduced because they are, particularly the ornamentals, are introduced because they have a wide climatic tolerance. If they can only live in Florida, there's much less incentive to introduce it than, if it can be sold all over the United States. So there's that factor. And the other is related is that the introduced species tend to be disturbance oriented. They like disturbed habitats. Mm-hmm. Farm fields and roadsides and so forth. Whereas the native species are largely things that existed in undisturbed habitats. And so when we go around disturbing habitats, then you get these things existing in a lot of different places, whereas the natives are kind of stuck in these pockets of less disturbed.
Well, I think that's a really good hypothesis, right? But it's one that hasn't necessarily been tested for a lot of the native species, just because we haven't widely introduced tons of these native species all across, different parts of the U.S. I mean, I agree with you. I think that's widely going to be true, that your invasives and your weedier species are disturbance specialists and that your native species generally are not. But I don't know that we've actually done a full-scale test to really nail down, how different they are. That's an awesome question. And your first part, definitely, the characteristics that we love for ornamental plants, that they're, wide climatic tolerance and that they grow fast and, produce lots of seeds and, showy things and stuff like that, are exactly the kind of things that we worry about in terms of invasive plants. So there is definitely a lot of overlap between that selection pressure coming in and what ends up within the invasive plant population. But I really like your question of whether, how different they are from the native populations, in terms of that. Yeah, in terms of the range infilling and the widespread. Good, I'll think about it.
Thanks, that was a good presentation. So I have a question about the spatial scale of the underlying processes. So when we think about temperature and precipitation, we often think about R.H. Whitaker's kind of distribution of the biomes, right?
But both temp and precip, they're kind of operating at a core spatial scale, as is biome scale, right? So when we think about across the landscape, we don't see a ton of variation in precip and temperature, right? So what's driving the variation at that spatial scale of species distribution and abundance? What do you think?
What's driving it? I think that's a fantastic
The leaf
spatial
birds
question that we all need
barrels
to
all over
keep
the woods,
working
right? What
on.
are the slats? What's driving it?
Yeah, so well, I mean, the null hypothesis is that it's all propagular pressure. I guess we could go after that one. You know, disturbance certainly affects them. The microhabitats like soil qualities and, you know, abiotic local things, you know, water availability aspect and slope and stuff like that. That presumably biotic resistance has something to do with not necessarily the distribution of species, but certainly the local abundance of species. So the diversity or traits of your native community might affect those. I mean, those are the things that I think about. I don't know, and actually Steve and I were talking about this morning of like whether there are data sets out there and trying to go after data sets that could actually try to answer those questions spatially.
One thing I think of just pops into mind is like the face experiments where you see poison ivy, for instance. Outside of the ring is like no poison ivy, inside is poison ivy. So clearly the availability of CO2 is limiting growth of that, not necessarily non-native invasive, but surely people. So just kind of maybe think about the scale.
Yeah, so CO2 certainly for invasive plants, there's consistent trends of CO2 facilitating invasives more so than it does native plants. A lot of that I think is just that going back to like the definition of weediness of, you know, fast growing species like more resources. And so absolutely CO2 is a tricky one spatially though, because, you know, like it's for the most part it's everywhere. Yeah.
So usually the plants when they introduced in the new environment, they actually introduce geological adaptation.
Sorry, can you just speak a little bit louder?
When plants are introduced into a new environment, usually the plants develop geological adaptations. For example, the plants in their native environment, they may have, like, for example, a large crop, but when they are introduced into a new environment, they may produce like smaller crops, things like that. Do you have any chance to do things like that?
I think that's a really fascinating question, though. I have never done any work on native range as well as non-native range of invasive plants, but there are a lot of people who are trying to look at those questions of, you know, is it one of the things that I think is most fascinating about that is actually the information about the evolutionary history of those species within their native range, and are there places on Earth just biogeographically that kind of like breed invasives just because they're like, you know, more competition, longer evolutionary history, more enemies that you could potentially be released from, those kind of things. You know, there are a couple of studies of that for, you know, like East Asian species being introduced to the Northeast is one example, and African grasses that are fire prone being introduced to a variety of continents and perpetuating fire cycles there is another example of that. So it's a really neat question, but I don't know anything about it.
So one last question from me. So can you comment on, you know, you're talking about these models of expansion, but those models are based on other models like regression models, we talked about PCA, which are based on observational data and so forth. You were commenting sort of on the organisms that have a smaller range, but doesn't this apply to like everything that the fact that we're doing these observational regressions sort of misinforms us in terms of what actually may happen?
Does the small range
So
apply
you're
to
talking
everything?
about like, so the assumption of equilibrium is one we have to make in order to do regression, to believe that in equilibrium it will help and happen in this way. So if the plants are not in equilibrium to begin with, and we do the regression, we're having a false assumption in terms of what the underlying factors are that are contributing to that.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
So it's a misrepresentation.
Well, but then I think that what these studies have shown to me is that if you're a widespread plant, that's not the case. Like the widespread plants, actually, it is probably a pretty good assumption to say like that it's close to equilibrium. So it's really, for me, it's like this narrow range versus wide range kind of thing that I would be more skeptical of narrow range models. And I guess the intriguing part for me, just biogeographically, is to try to figure out like more things like that. You know, like, are there particular cases when we should trust the models more or trust the models less, because that will certainly lead us to better monitoring and better management later on.
Even like the plasticity question, it's like, so I'm working with animals instead of plants, but you think about bear, right? Like, there's no regression for bear. Bear can sleep range when he wants to, right? So, you know, it seems like there's like a contrast there. Inherent in organisms as opposed to the habitat. Is that, would you?
Yeah, I mean, people who do spatial models on bears use very different methods than people who do spatial models on plants.
Right.
But part of that is also because you also have absence data, and you can do, you know, like, you can observe things, you know, multiple times through, you know, if you get collars on bears. Yeah, it's a big problem in terms of trying to understand stuff. Yeah, and that's why we've been trying to go after abundance information more and more, because at least it doesn't necessarily give us absence data, but at least it gives us more insight into, like, here it's actually invasive versus there it's just like there's a plant.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, just one fun question to the end. A lot of the ideas seem to be about the questions were about data collection, whether the data was available or not. If you were a data czar, what are some key strategies you would implement to help better answer these questions? So maybe abundance.
Yeah, so that's great that you're asking that question. We actually have been trying to put together some like recommendations for the collection of invasive plant abundance. So there's fantastic work going on through like IMAP invasives in the state of New York, through a lot of the different state level organizations, but those tend to be just occurrences. And so we don't have absences. We don't have any sense of how bad the infestation is or the aerial extent of the infestation. So the two main things that I would love to have for plants are an estimate of percent cover and an estimate of the area of infestation. And those could be completely like just, you know, I don't know, 20% cover, there's a fair bit of it here kind of thing, and about the size of this room. That would be totally fine for a lot of the modeling stuff that we're trying to do. But we have also been looking through, there's a citizen science and management database called EdMaps, and we've been looking through that larger database to try to see what people are doing when they're reporting abundance. And those tend to be kind of ranges for percent cover. So like less than 1%, 1 to 5, 5 to something, 10, 20, 25, pick your number there, or greater than that. And those also work really well when we can't, because we can't ask, you know, most managers to go out and start running like fixed transects, you know, across the landscape at, you know, 1,000 points, but they're going to be at 1,000 points. They could probably say, you know, it's about 5% cover or something in these areas, and that information gives us a lot of power too. Thanks for asking.
Okay, please continue again.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.